The smell reaches you first. Cigar smoke, old and faint. The kind that has lived in the walls of a room long enough to become part of the room itself, rather than something a person brought in from outside. Then the smell of paper, the specific dry warmth of books that have been opened many times across many decades. Then something beneath both of those, harder to name, the particular stillness of a space where a mind that was never quiet has finally gone quiet. The bedroom is on the second floor of a house called Stormfield, in Reading, Connecticut. The windows face west. The April light of 1910 comes in low and long across the hills, the way spring light does in New England, when the season has arrived on the calendar but has not yet committed to the warmth it keeps promising. Outside, if you knew where to look, a smear of brightness is moving through the darkening sky on the same long path it travelled 75 years ago. The last time it passed this close to the sun. He is in the bed. There are books on the table beside him, because there are always books. There is a cigar, because there is always a cigar. He is 74 years old and tired in the particular way of a man who has outlived almost everyone he loved and kept working anyway. Kept writing. Kept performing. Kept telling the truth about America in the only way he ever knew how, which was to make it funny enough that people would listen before they realized what they were hearing. His name is Samuel Langhorne Clemens. The world knows him as Mark Twain. There is a long way between this bedroom and the Missouri river town where the story begins. Every mile of it is worth knowing. Chapter 1. The River That Made Him. There is a sound that anyone who grew up near the Mississippi River in the middle of the 19th century would have known so well that it stopped being a sound and became something closer to the rhythm their own heart was keeping. It began low, almost below hearing, a vibration in the ground before it was a vibration in the air. Then it built, half mechanical and half musical, rolling across the flat brown water and the low Missouri bluffs and the small towns strung along the western bank like beads on a string, until it arrived as a full-throated moan that every person within half a mile recognized before they were fully awake. It was the sound of a steamboat coming around the bend, for a boy named Samuel Clemens. Growing up in the river town of Hannibal, Missouri, that sound was not just a sound. It was a promise. It was evidence that the world went further than the eye could see from the levee, and that some people, the ones who knew the right things and had learned the right skills, got to move through that larger world while everyone else watched from the bank. He was born on the 30th of November, 1835, in the small village of Florida, Missouri, 30 miles inland from the river. The sixth child of John Marshall Clemens and Jane Lampton Clemens. His father was a lawyer and sometime land speculator, a tall and serious man of Virginia stock, who carried himself with the particular dignity of a person who expected more from life than life was currently providing. His mother was the opposite in almost every visible way. Jane Lampton Clemens was warm, quick, and funny in the way that people are funny, when humour is not a performance but a reflex. And she loved her children with the intensity of a woman who had already buried 2 of them before Sam arrived. The family moved to Hannibal when Sam was around 4 years old, and it is Hannibal, not Florida, that made him. Hannibal was a real river town. Its population stood at around 500 when the Clemens family arrived and grew steadily as the decade turned and the river traffic thickened. It sat on a low bluff above the Mississippi, looking east across the water toward Illinois, and its entire economy and social life and sense of itself was organized around what the river brought and what the river took away. What the river brought was everything: goods from St. Louis and New Orleans, travelers heading west, news from a world that felt genuinely distant from a Missouri childhood, and the boats themselves, the magnificent, impractical, smoke-belching floating palaces of the antebellum era, with their white paint and their twin stacks and their great churning paddle wheels and their crews of pilots and roustabouts and gamblers and drifters who carried the whole romance of American movement in the way they stood at the rail and watched the shore go by. What the river took was also everything. It took people. The Mississippi was not a gentle river. It flooded. It shifted. It pulled men under and did not return them. In the years Sam Clemens was growing up in Hannibal, the river took his best friend in a drowning, and it took others, and it left behind in the town the particular grief of a place that has given the water too much and keeps giving anyway, because there is no other way to live besides something that large and that indifferent. John Marshall Clemens died in 1847. When Sam was 11 years old, he died of pneumonia, leaving the family in circumstances that were modest, even by the standards of a small Missouri town. Sam left school that year. He was done with formal education at 11, and what he would say about this in later years, in the particular way he had of framing every disadvantage of his early life as a kind of gift, was that his real education began the moment his classroom education ended. That is partly performance. Twain was always performing, even in his autobiography, but it is also in the way that the best performances are. Partly true, because the Hannibal that Sam Clemens moved through in those years after his father's death, free from school and alert in the way that a child turned loose in the world becomes alert, was a genuinely American place in the fullest and most complicated sense of that word. It was a slave-holding town in a slave-holding state. The people Sam grew up among, the ones he loved and admired and later wrote about with a precision that made them immortal, lived inside a system of profound moral contradiction with the ease of people who had never been asked to examine it. His father had owned a slave. His uncle, on whose farm Sam spent long childhood summers that he later described as among the most formative experiences of his life, owned several. The boys Sam played with were white. The people who worked in the houses and the fields around them were not free, and Sam, at 11 and 12 and 13, absorbed all of it the way a writer absorbs the world before they know they are a writer, completely and without the filtering apparatus that conscious attention provides. This is not a footnote to the story of Mark Twain. It is the story. The writer who would eventually produce Huckleberry Finn, the novel that Ernest Hemingway described in his book Green Hills of Africa, published in 1935, as the source from which all modern American literature derives. That writer was being assembled in Hannibal in those years, from the specific and irreducible experience of growing up surrounded by slavery and not yet knowing there was a question to ask about it. Consider what Charles Dickens was doing at roughly the same moment. On the other side of the Atlantic, Dickens had also left school young, had also worked in conditions that most children were not supposed to work in, had also absorbed the texture of poverty and labour and human cruelty from the inside rather than reading about it in books. Both men would eventually produce fiction that changed the way their countries understood themselves. Both men would become two of the most celebrated writers of their respective nations. The difference is that Dickens's early poverty left wounds, and the wound became the engine. Twain's early freedom, even inside a morally compromised world, left curiosity, and the curiosity became the voice. In 1848, when he was 12 years old, Sam went to work as a printer's apprentice at the Hannibal Gazette. Printing was a trade, and trades were what you learned when a professional education was no longer available. But printing, for Sam Clemens, turned out to be something considerably more important than a trade. It was a reading machine. A printer in the 19th century set type by hand, one letter at a time, composing each line in a small metal tray before transferring it to the press. To set type, you had to read the text not once, but repeatedly, handling each word physically, your fingers moving through the letters of other people's sentences with an intimacy that no other form of reading produces. You absorbed the rhythms of other writers' prose, the way a musician absorbs the structure of music, through the hands as much as through the eyes. Good sentences felt different from bad ones under the fingertips before they were fully legible on the page. Sam set type for newspapers, for local advertising, for the small publications that a Missouri river town required. He read everything that came through the shop. He read it the way a printer reads, which is to say, with his whole body. And what he found in those texts, the good ones and the terrible ones alike, was the beginning of an understanding of how written language worked and why it did not always work, what made a sentence move and what made it die on the page. His brother Orion acquired the Hannibal Western Union newspaper in 1850, and Sam went to work for him, eventually not just setting type, but writing. The pieces are small, local, functional, but people who have examined the archive of Hannibal journalism from that period note something in the writing attributed to young Sam Clemens: a precision, a preference for the concrete over the abstract, a sense of timing that was, even then, not quite like anyone else's. He was 17 years old, working for wages that did not always arrive, living in a town where the future felt like a low ceiling with no obvious way through it, and the river was still there. It is worth pausing here to say something directly about what the Mississippi River meant to the American imagination in the middle of the 19th century, because it is easy, from a distance of more than 150 years, to lose the scale of it. The Mississippi in 1850 was not a scenic feature, it was the arterial system of a continent. Everything west of the Appalachians that moved on or toward or because of the Mississippi. The economy of the middle of the country ran on it. The culture organized itself around it. And the river pilots who navigated it, who knew every sandbar and snag and shifting channel from St. Louis to New Orleans, occupied in the public imagination of that era a position not entirely unlike what astronauts occupied in the 1960s. They were the people who went where the rest of the country only dreamed of going. A licensed steamboat pilot in 1855 earned more than the Vice President of the United States. Sam Clemens knew all of this. He had known it since he was old enough to stand on the Hannibal levee and watch the boats go by. And somewhere in the years between his father's death and his 17th birthday, the dream of becoming a pilot had taken root in the specific way that certain dreams take root in certain people, not as a vague aspiration, but as a fixed point around which everything else in the future was organized. He left Hannibal in 1853. What followed were years of movement and work and looking and absorbing that had no obvious direction, but were, as the best educations often are, preparing him for something he could not yet name. He went to New York. He went to Philadelphia. He worked as a printer in the cities of the East and read the newspapers and the libraries and the streets with the same comprehensive appetite he had brought to everything since he was old enough to notice that the world was large and strange and full of material. He was not famous. He was not even particularly visible. He was a young man from Missouri with a gift he had not yet fully identified, moving through a country on the edge of a catastrophe that no one had quite admitted was coming, taking everything in. The river was waiting, and what it would teach him, in the years just ahead, would become the deepest foundation of everything he wrote for the rest of his life. Not just the book set on the water, all of it, the precision, the patience, the understanding that the surface of a thing is never the whole of it, and that the difference between a pilot who knows the river and one who merely thinks he knows it is the difference between arriving and not arriving at all. He was about to find out what it cost to learn a river, and about to find out that the learning was worth every bit of what it cost. Chapter 2. The Apprentice Who Ran Away. Sam Clemens left Hannibal for the last time as a resident in June of 1853. He was 17 years old. He had a small amount of money saved from his work at the newspaper, and he had something else that would prove more durable than money. He had been watching and listening and storing for 17 years, and the storage was full in the way that a person gets full when the place they are in can no longer hold what they are becoming. He told his mother he was going to St. Louis to visit his sister Pamela. That was partly true. St. Louis was the first stop, but it was not the destination. New York was the destination. He arrived in New York in the summer of 1853, and what he found there was the largest thing he had encountered in his life to that point. Not just in physical scale, though the physical scale was genuinely staggering for a boy from a Missouri river town of 2,000 people. What was large about New York in 1853 was the density of it, the density of people, of noise, of commerce, of ambition, of every variety of human type that the Atlantic world produced, all of it compressed into the lower end of a long island and moving at a speed that had no equivalent in anything Hannibal had prepared him for. He found work immediately at a printing house on Cliff Street. He was a skilled compositor by this point, fast and accurate, and skilled compositors were always in demand in a city running dozens of newspapers and periodicals and publishing operations of every size and ambition. The work was familiar. The surroundings were not. He wrote letters home to his mother and to Orion during these months, and those letters have survived. They are remarkable documents for reasons that have nothing to do with literary ambition. They are the letters of a young man who is genuinely trying to see and describe what he is seeing, with a directness and a specificity that most 17-year-olds do not bring to correspondence with their families. He described the Crystal Palace exhibition at the New York World's Fair of 1853 with a care for detail that Ron Powers, in his biography, Mark Twain, A Life published in 2005, identifies as early evidence of a descriptive intelligence already operating well above the ordinary. He was not performing for his mother. He was trying to get it right. That instinct, to get it right rather than to get it impressive, is the thing that separates writers who last from writers who do not. Sam Clemens had it at 17, without knowing he had it, without knowing yet that he was going to be a writer at all. From New York he went to Philadelphia. Again, finding compositor work without difficulty. Again, reading everything the city had to offer. Again, storing. He visited Independence Hall. He visited the printing office where Benjamin Franklin had worked a century before, and he wrote about it to Orion with a reverence that tells you something about what the craft of printing meant to him. It was not just a trade. It was a lineage, and he was part of it. Now consider what this period of wandering was actually producing, because it is easy to read these years as a gap between the Missouri childhood and the river career that followed. That reading misses the point entirely. What Sam was building in those printing houses and boarding rooms and city streets was a mental archive of American life at the working level, the level that most literature of his era either ignored entirely or described from the outside with the slightly condescending warmth of a writer who had observed poverty but never lived inside it. He was not observing, he was inhabiting, and the difference between those two things is the difference between a writer who describes a place and a writer who makes you feel you have been there. Few American writers before him had combined the literary intelligence and the working life experience at this level, in a way that produced something genuinely new. The closest comparison remains Dickens, and even that comparison has limits. Dickens had absorbed the specific humiliations of a blacking factory in London. Twain had absorbed the specific texture of a country in motion, a restless, expanding, arguing, laughing country that was about to break itself apart and did not know it yet. What the wandering years gave him was not simply material to write about. It gave him calibration. He knew, from the inside of his own experience, when a sentence about American life was right and when it was performing rightness without being right. That calibration is the thing that makes Huckleberry Finn feel lived rather than observed. And it was built in printing houses during years that looked, from the outside, like restlessness. He spent parts of 1854 in St. Louis, parts in Muscatine, Iowa, where Orion had relocated, parts moving between jobs in a pattern that looked from the outside like uncertainty, but was, from the inside, the purposeful motion of a person who has not yet found the thing, but knows they will recognize it when they find it. In 1856, at the age of 20, he made a decision that was characteristic of him in its combination of impulse and determination. He would go to the Amazon River in South America, where he had read that opportunities existed. He booked passage on a riverboat heading south from Cincinnati, down the Ohio and into the Mississippi. He did not get to South America. What happened instead was that somewhere on the journey south, in a conversation with a pilot named Horace Bixby, the Amazon plan dissolved, and the real plan, the one that had been waiting underneath it for years, came forward. He asked Horace Bixby to teach him the river. Bixby was one of the most respected pilots on the Mississippi, a compact and exacting man who had navigated the river in conditions that would have stopped most men. He agreed to take Sam on as a cub pilot for the sum of $500, a substantial amount that Sam did not have but arranged to borrow from his brother-in-law in St. Louis. The apprenticeship began in the spring of 1857, and what it required was not what Sam had imagined. He had imagined learning landmarks. He had imagined memorizing the shape of the banks, the location of the towns, the positions of the more famous hazards. He had imagined something like geography, a fixed thing that could be learned once and then known. What Bixby taught him was that the river was never fixed. The Mississippi was in constant motion, not just in the obvious sense that water flows, but in the deeper sense that the river changed its own structure continuously, shifting channels, moving sandbars, creating new hazards and eliminating old ones with a patience and thoroughness that made every previous mental map obsolete. To know the river was not to have memorized a set of facts about it. It was to have developed a quality of attention that could read the surface of the water and understand, from the specific texture and colour and movement of what was visible, what was happening in the invisible depths beneath. Bixby, as Twain describes him in Life on the Mississippi, published in 1883, was merciless about this. He would point to a stretch of water that looked perfectly calm and ask his cub to identify the hazard beneath it. He would ask for the exact position of a shoal in the dark. At a bend, Sam had not yet memorized, in conditions of reduced visibility, and accept nothing less than precision. Sam was humiliated regularly. He wrote about this in Life on the Mississippi with an honesty that is one of the reasons that book holds up so well more than 140 years after its publication. He did not soften the portrait of himself as a student. He was overconfident at first, as all beginners are. Then he was terrified, as all beginners become when the actual complexity of what they are trying to learn becomes clear. Then, slowly, through the accumulation of corrected errors and repeated passages, and the particular knowledge that only comes from doing something wrong enough times to understand why the right way is right, he began to know the river. He received his pilot's license on the 9th of April, 1859, at the age of 23, and what he had, when it was done, was not just a professional credential. It was a way of seeing that he would carry for the rest of his life. A trained habit of reading the surface of things for what lay beneath them. A distrust of appearances. An understanding that the most dangerous water was often the water that looked the calmest. Every piece of serious writing he produced for the next 50 years has this quality in it. The calm surface, the hidden current, the reader brought safely, or deliberately unsafely, through a passage that was more complicated than it first appeared. He learned it on the Mississippi. He learned it from Horace Bixby, who had no idea he was teaching a writer. The years on the river, 1857 to 1861, were what Twain himself called, in later life, the happiest of his existence. He was doing work he loved, work that demanded everything he had and rewarded complete competence with a freedom and authority that few occupations offered. A licensed pilot on the Mississippi answered to no one while his boat was moving. He earned good money. He was sovereign in his domain. And then the war came. Chapter 3. The River Pilot and the War He Avoided. The war did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way most catastrophes arrive. Gradually, and then suddenly, with a long period of mounting tension, during which almost everyone found reasons to believe that the worst would somehow not happen, followed by a moment when it was simply and irreversibly there. For Sam Clemens, piloting boats on the Mississippi in the spring of 1861, the war arrived in the form of a river that stopped working. When the Confederate States began their secession, and the military situation on the western rivers became uncertain. Commercial traffic on the Mississippi collapsed almost overnight. The economic logic that had made the river the center of American commercial life depended entirely on the political unity of the country. And that unity was gone. The boats stopped running. The pilots, who had been among the best paid professionals in America, found themselves with a skill that had, for the moment, no market. Sam was 25 years old. He had a profession he loved and was good at, and it had just ceased to exist as a functioning economy. What he did next is one of the more honestly told stories in his autobiography, and it is honest precisely because it is not flattering. He went home to Hannibal. He joined a small Confederate militia unit forming in Marion County, Missouri, a ragged collection of young men who called themselves the Marion Rangers and who had, between them, roughly as much military experience as you would expect from a group of Missouri boys who had never been anywhere near a war. Sam's account of this episode, written more than 20 years later and published in 1885 in Century magazine under the title The Private History of a Campaign That Failed, is one of the funniest and most ruthlessly self-aware pieces he ever produced. The Marion Rangers were, by his account, comprehensively incompetent as a military unit. They could not agree on who was in command. They were afraid of the dark. They retreated from threats that turned out to be farm animals. They spent more energy debating the ethics and logistics of their situation than doing anything that could be described as soldiering. There is one detail from those 2 weeks that Sam returned to more than once in later years, and it is not a funny detail. On a night when the unit was sheltering in a farmhouse, they heard riders approaching in the darkness, and someone gave the order to fire. They fired. In the confusion and the dark, a man fell. Whether he died from their volley or from wounds he already carried is something the historical record does not settle cleanly. What is settled is what Sam felt when he understood what had happened. He described it, 2 decades later, as the specific and sickening weight of having perhaps taken a life in a cause he was not sure he believed in, for reasons he could not fully explain, in a darkness so complete he could not even see the face of the person he may have harmed. He left the Marion Rangers in mid-July of 1861. He did not go back. Historians have examined this account carefully, as they should with any retrospective self-narration, and the documented record of the Marion Rangers is sparse enough that the specific incident cannot be independently verified in detail. What can be said is that his account of why he left has a quality of genuine moral reckoning that distinguishes it from the kind of war story a person tells to make themselves look good. He took a harder look at his own behaviour than most people apply to their own failures. This willingness to examine himself honestly, to apply to his own conduct the same satirical intelligence he applied to everyone else's, was one of the things that made him genuinely different from most public figures of his era. It did not come naturally. It was a quality he developed across decades. But the seed of it is there, in that Missouri farmhouse, in the refusal to turn a moment of confusion and possible violence into a story of innocent misadventure. His brother Orion provided the answer to what came next. Orion had been appointed Secretary of the Nevada Territory by the Lincoln administration, and he was heading west to take up his post. He needed someone to accompany him and serve as his assistant. The pay was not impressive, but Nevada was a long way from Missouri. And Missouri, in the summer of 1861, was a place where the war was very close, and the choice of which side you were on was becoming less and less avoidable. Sam went west with Orion. The journey took 3 weeks by stagecoach, across the plains and the desert and the mountains, and Sam observed it all with the same comprehensive attention he had brought to everything since childhood. The territory they crossed was genuinely unlike anything in his previous experience. The scale of it, the emptiness of it, the specific beauty of a landscape that did not care whether you found it beautiful and would kill you with complete indifference if you were not paying attention. He arrived in Carson City, Nevada, in August of 1861. He was 25 years old. He had been a farm boy, a printer's apprentice, a wandering typesetter, a riverboat pilot, a 2-week Confederate soldier, and a stagecoach passenger across the Great Plains. He had not yet published anything that anyone outside a Missouri newspaper had read. He was not yet Mark Twain. Nevada was about to change that. The Nevada Territory in 1861 was a place in the grip of a specific and intense variety of American madness. Silver had been discovered in the Comstock lode in 1859, and the discovery had produced the kind of mass movement that mineral wealth reliably produces in the American psyche. A sudden convergence of thousands of people from everywhere, all of them carrying the belief that they were about to become rich, and most of them wrong. The mining camps and new towns had the quality of places that know they might not exist in 5 years, which produces a particular kind of human behavior. The inhibitions that stable communities develop over time had not yet formed. The social pressure to be respectable was minimal, because respectability was not what anyone had come for. Sam caught the fever immediately. He spent several months in and around the mining districts, prospecting with varying degrees of seriousness and uniform lack of success. He staked claims. He did the back-breaking physical work of following veins into the rock. He came close, or believed he came close, to significant discoveries that then evaporated for reasons that were sometimes geological and sometimes legal and sometimes simply the particular bad luck that attaches itself to a person trying to do something that is not what they are meant to be doing. He was not meant to be a miner. In the fall of 1862, running low on money and on the particular optimism that prospecting requires, he accepted a job as a reporter for the Territorial Enterprise, a newspaper in Virginia City, Nevada. The pay was $25 a week. He was, by every account that survives from that period, immediately and obviously extraordinary at this. The colleagues who worked alongside him later described a writer who could produce copy faster than almost anyone they had seen, who had an instinct for what was interesting that operated below the level of conscious decision, and who was already developing a voice that was recognizably different from every other voice in American journalism. It was in Virginia City, Nevada, on the 2nd of February, 1863, that Samuel Langhorne Clemens first used the name Mark Twain in print. The name came from his river days. It was a leadsman's call, the cry a crew member made when taking depth soundings in shallow water. Mark Twain meant 2 fathoms, 12 feet, the minimum depth considered safe for a loaded steamboat to navigate. It was the line between safe water and dangerous water, the boundary a pilot had to know and respect. He chose it as a pen name for reasons he never fully explained in any single place. But what the name carried was not subtle. It carried the river. It carried the specific knowledge of where the safe passage was and where it was not. It carried the authority of a man who had learned a dangerous thing well enough to be trusted with other people's lives. And it carried, perhaps, a quiet irony, because the writer who took this careful navigational name was about to spend the next several decades sailing his readers directly into the most uncomfortable waters American culture had to offer, and calling it Safe Passage. He was 27 years old. He had a name. He was about to find out what the name could do. Chapter 4. Nevada, Silver, and the Birth of Mark Twain. Virginia City in 1863 was not a place that encouraged restraint. It was a mining boomtown at the height of its particular fever, a city of roughly 20,000 people built almost overnight on the eastern slope of Mount Davidson in the Nevada desert, running on silver money and silver ambition and the specific social atmosphere that develops when a large number of people have arrived somewhere with the shared understanding that normal rules do not fully apply. The territorial enterprise, where Sam had come to work, was not a small-town paper in any meaningful sense. It was a serious operation serving a serious readership, and it expected serious work from the people it employed. What it got from Sam Clemens was something it had not expected and did not know quite how to categorize. He was producing the work the paper needed, covering the mines, the courts, the legislature in Carson City, the full range of events that a Nevada territorial newspaper was required to document, but he was doing it in a way that kept attracting attention beyond the events themselves. The attention was for the voice. There was a quality in the writing that was hard to name precisely, but impossible to miss once you had encountered it. A dryness, a timing, a way of arranging facts so that the humour in them became visible without the writer appearing to have done anything to make it so. The best comic writers have this quality, the ability to present absurdity straight-faced and let the reader discover it. And Sam had it in a form that his colleagues recognized immediately as unusual. Joseph Goodman, the editor of the Territorial Enterprise and one of the better judges of writing talent in the American West of that era, gave Sam considerable latitude to develop whatever the voice was becoming. Goodman understood, as good editors do, that the thing he was watching develop was worth protecting from the pressure to be more conventional. He was also, in this period, developing what would become a central feature of his public identity. He was learning to perform. The American lecture circuit of the 19th century was a genuine cultural institution. Before radio, before film, before any of the technologies that would eventually distribute entertainment into every home, the lecture was one of the primary ways that a public figure connected with a mass audience. The best lecturers drew crowds of hundreds or thousands, charged admission, and could generate income and fame on a scale that writing alone could not match in that era. Sam attended lectures. He watched how they worked. He noticed, with the specific attention of someone filing information for future use, what made an audience lean forward and what made them drift, what produced genuine laughter and what produced the polite attention that is an audience's way of waiting for something to be over. The writing and the performing were, for him, two expressions of the same instrument, working together in a way that few American public figures before him had managed at this level. He was not just writing a new kind of American prose. He was simultaneously developing the performance that would deliver it, learning the stage the way he had learned the river. Through observation and repetition and the willingness to be wrong in front of people until he understood what right felt like. In the spring of 1864, A dispute connected to one of his more aggressive pieces of Nevada journalism made his continued presence in Virginia City uncomfortable enough that leaving became the reasonable choice. He left for San Francisco in May of 1864. San Francisco, in the mid-1860s, was a city living at a temperature slightly above what most places sustained. It was younger than New York and rawer than Boston, and considerably more willing to be surprised. The literary culture of the city was real and active. Bret Harty was there. The city had a newspaper culture as competitive and alive as any in the country. Sam worked for the San Francisco Morning Call and found the work mostly miserable. The Call was a conventional paper in its requirements, and conventional requirements did not suit what he was developing. He was writing too much, too fast, on subjects that did not interest him. In the fall of 1865, he went to the gold country of Calaveras County in the Sierra Nevada foothills, staying with two miners named Dick Stoker and Jim Gillis at a cabin on Jackass Hill. In the evenings around the fire, he heard stories. Mining camp stories. The oral tradition of the California gold rush. Tall tales in the specific American idiom that had developed wherever men gathered in rough circumstances and needed to entertain each other through the long hours when the work was done. One of the stories he heard in those months was about a frog. He wrote it down in the winter of 1865 and sent it to a New York humorist named Artemus Ward, who had asked him for a contribution to a book Ward was compiling. The piece arrived too late for the book. Ward's publisher, recognizing something in it, sent it instead to the Saturday Press in New York, where it appeared on the 18th of November, 1865, under the title Jim Smiley and His Jumping Frog. It was later published under the title most people know it by The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. The effect was immediate and nationwide. Newspapers across the country reprinted it. Readers who had never heard of Sam Clemens or Mark Twain encountered the story and looked for more. The story had done what the best comic writing does. It had found a frequency that almost every reader could receive. A combination of vernacular voice and narrative precision and perfectly calibrated absurdity that worked whether you were reading it in New York or New Orleans or Chicago. It is worth pausing to say something about why the Jumping Frog story worked, because understanding it tells you something important about what Twain was doing that was genuinely new. American humor in the mid-19th century depended largely on a simple mechanism. There was the sophisticated narrator, educated and ironic, and there was the vernacular subject, folksy and comic, and the humor came from the gap between them. The narrator stood above the material and invited the reader to share the superior position. What Twain did in the Jumping Frog story was more complicated and more subversive. His narrator is ostensibly the sophisticated one, the put-upon Easterner subjected to a garrulous Western storyteller named Simon Wheeler. But the joke, when you look carefully, is on the narrator. Simon Wheeler is not the fool. He is the con. He is telling his story with a perfect deadpan that leaves the sophisticated narrator completely unable to determine whether he is being made fun of or not. The reader knows. The narrator does not. And the pleasure is not the pleasure of superiority, but the pleasure of being let in on a joke that someone else is missing. This inversion, the apparent rube who is actually running the game, the surface that conceals a depth the sophisticated observer cannot read, is the Mississippi pilot's understanding of water applied to narrative, and it would run through everything Twain wrote for the rest of his career. In 1866, he went to Hawaii. then called the Sandwich Islands, as a travel correspondent for the Sacramento Union. He returned to San Francisco in the summer of 1866 with material and with a decision that had been forming for some time. He was going to lecture. On the 2nd of October, 1866, Mark Twain gave his first public lecture at the Academy of Music in San Francisco. He had rented the hall himself, which meant the financial risk was entirely his. He had advertised the event with a poster that included, at the bottom, a line that became one of the most quoted pieces of his promotional writing. The doors open at 7. The trouble begins at 8. The room laughed, not politely. The audience that night laughed in the way that audiences laugh when something has caught them genuinely off guard, when the timing has landed so precisely that the laughter is involuntary rather than chosen. He had found the other half of his instrument. He already knew he could do it on the page. Now he knew he could do it standing in a room. The voice that worked in print worked in person, and the person who delivered it, the slightly dishevelled, slow-talking, apparently distracted figure who seemed perpetually on the verge of having forgotten what he was saying, was a performance of considerable technical sophistication that looked like no performance at all. He was 29 years old. He had a name that was beginning to mean something. He had a voice that no one else had. He was going east. Chapter 5. The Frog That Jumped Around the World. He arrived in New York in January of 1867, and New York received him the way cities receive people who arrive already carrying a reputation. Not with open arms exactly, but with attention. The attention of a place accustomed to deciding which reputations are real and which are provincial artifacts that dissolve on contact with a larger world. Mark Twain's reputation did not dissolve. He lectured. He wrote for newspapers and magazines, producing the kind of copy that New York editors recognized immediately as the work of someone who understood what an audience wanted before the audience quite understood it themselves. He moved through the city with the ease of a man who had been moving through unfamiliar places his entire adult life, and had long since stopped finding unfamiliarity threatening. A group of American tourists was planning an excursion to Europe and the Holy Land aboard a ship called the Quaker City, organized as a kind of grand cultural pilgrimage, the sort of thing that respectable American families of the era undertook when they wanted to confirm their relationship to the civilization their country had come from. It was, in its aspiration, a serious enterprise. In its reality, as Twain would document it, something considerably more complicated and considerably funnier. He secured a berth as a travelling correspondent for the San Francisco Alta California, which would pay his expenses in exchange for letters from the journey. He sailed on the 8th of June, 1867. The journey lasted 5 months. He went to the Azores, Gibraltar, France, Italy, Greece, Turkey, the Holy Land, Egypt. He saw the monuments of Western civilization that every educated American of the era was expected to reverence, and he looked at them with the eyes of a man who had grown up in Missouri and learned the river and prospected in Nevada, and was not, temperamentally or culturally, inclined to reverence anything simply because someone told him he should. He was not anti-European. That is a simplification that misses the actual joke. He was anti-reverence. He was specifically and precisely against the performance of awe that Americans on the European tour were expected to produce. The dutiful gasping at old paintings and old ruins and old everything the pretense that age and cultural prestige were the same thing as quality. He looked at a painting that every guidebook called a masterpiece and said what he actually thought rather than what he was supposed to think. He was funny about it, but the humour was not the detached amusement of a cynic. It was the humour of a man who was genuinely trying to see what was in front of him and found the gap between the official version and the actual version persistently, irresistibly comic. The book that came out of the journey, The Innocents Abroad, was published by the American Publishing Company of Hartford in July of 1869. It was sold by subscription, with agents travelling door to door taking orders before publication. The Innocents Abroad sold more than 70,000 copies in its first year in the United States alone, making it one of the best-selling American books of the era. It remained the best-selling of all his books throughout his lifetime. Twain was 33 years old. He was famous in a way that was now national rather than regional, attached to a book that people were buying and reading and giving to each other rather than simply talking about. He was also, in the middle of this ascent, doing something his public persona did not particularly advertise. He was falling in love. He had seen a photograph of a young woman named Olivia Langdon in the summer of 1867, shown to him by her brother Charles on the Quaker City voyage. Charles had taken out a small ivory miniature portrait of his sister, the kind that people carried of family members before photographs became cheap and common, and Sam had looked at it with more attention than the social situation quite required. He later wrote about that moment in his Autobiography of 1906, saying that from that day to the day he died, she was never out of his mind or heart. He met Olivia Langdon in person in New York in December of 1867. Charles had invited him to join the Langdon family at the St. Nicholas Hotel, and that evening the family attended a reading by Charles Dickens at Steinway Hall on New Year's Eve, and Sam accompanied them. He later wrote about the evening himself, describing how hearing Dickens read that night made the real fortune of his life, not in dollars but in happiness, because it was the night he first spent time in the company of the woman who would become his wife. He was 32. She was 22. She was the daughter of Jervis Langdon, a coal merchant in Elmira, New York, who had made a substantial fortune and who had been, which was not irrelevant to his daughter's character and commitments, an active supporter of the Underground Railroad in the years before the war. The Langdon family was prosperous, serious, and deeply principled in ways that had been tested rather than merely declared. Sam Clemens, arriving at the Langdon family's attention as a potential suitor for their daughter, was not an obvious match. He was a former river pilot and Nevada miner and California journalist with a growing reputation for irreverence and a personal history that did not include anything Jervis Langdon would have recognized as a settled life. He drank. He smoked constantly. The cigars that would become one of the defining features of his public image. He had no property, no established home, and an income that was real but not yet predictable. What he had was Olivia's attention, and Olivia's attention, once given, was not easily redirected. He wrote to her at a volume and with a persistence that tested the patience of the postal system and of Olivia herself, who was not immediately receptive and said so. He proposed too early, was refused, proposed again, and was asked to spend time as a brother rather than a suitor, which he did with a discipline that cost him considerably more than he let on in the letters. Jervis Langdon conducted what amounted to a reference check, writing to people in California and Nevada who had known Sam and asking for their honest assessment. The responses he received were, by most accounts, not encouraging. Sam's friends from his Western years, whether out of honesty or mischief or some combination of both, did not produce endorsements that a concerned father would have found reassuring. Jervis Langdon read the letters and made his own judgment anyway. He told Sam that it appeared he would have to be his own reference, and then he gave his approval. The engagement became formal in February of 1869. They were married on the 2nd of February, 1870, in Elmira, at the Langdon family home. There is a version of what happened to Sam Clemens when he married Olivia Langdon that was advanced most forcefully by the critic Van Wyck Brooks in a study called The Ordeal of Mark Twain, published in 1920. In Brooks's reading, Olivia represents the forces of Eastern respectability that tamed the wild Western humorist, softened his edges, and in doing so diminished what was most original about him. The letters between them do not support this reading. They survive in large numbers, and Ron Powers drew on them extensively in his 2005 biography. Olivia was not a passive presence in his creative life. She read his manuscripts and argued with him about them. She had opinions about his work that were specific and considered. She pushed back with the engaged response of a reader who knew the work from the inside and was not afraid to say when something was wrong. He loved her in a way that was, for a man who performed most of his emotional life in public, entirely private. He did not write about Olivia Clemens the way he wrote about everything else he encountered. What he felt for her was not available for the treatment that made everything else comic. He was 34 years old when they married. He had been a great many things. He was about to become something new. Outside, the first Hartford winter was settling in. Somewhere north of the city, on a street called Farmington Avenue, a plot of land was waiting. He did not know it yet, but the house was coming, and the children, and the years that would give him everything before they took almost all of it back. Chapter 6. Olivia, Hartford, and the Years of Abundance. There is a house that still stands on Farmington Avenue in Hartford, Connecticut. That tells you more about Mark Twain than almost anything he wrote about himself. It was completed in 1874, designed by the architect Edward Tuckerman Potter at Sam's direction and with Sam's continuous involvement in every decision. It has 25 rooms spread across 3 floors and 11,500 square feet. It has a porch designed to suggest the deck of a riverboat, which was not an accident. It has a study on the top floor where Twain wrote late into the night, strictly off-limits to almost everyone in the house. It has a speaking tube system connecting the floors, which delighted him in the way that any practical technology that worked reliably delighted him. It has central heating, hot running water, and 2 flushing toilets. Technologies so advanced for 1874 that the house was, in practical terms, one of the most modern private residences in the United States at that moment. One of Twain's biographers described the house as part steamboat, part medieval fortress, and part cuckoo clock. That description is accurate, and it is also, in its way, a description of the man who built it. Sam and Olivia did not pay for the house entirely on their own. Olivia's mother, who adored her son-in-law and spent extended periods with the family each year, helped underwrite a household that consistently spent at the edge of what its literary income could sustain. This was a pattern that would eventually matter more than anyone in the Hartford years was fully willing to admit. The first years of the marriage had already brought a grief that deepened that pattern in ways that are not always given the space they deserve in accounts of the Clemens family. Their first child, a son named Langdon, was born prematurely on the 7th of November, 1870. He was never robust. He was sickly in the specific way of premature infants in an era before the medicine existed to address what made them sickly, and the household organized itself around the hope that he would strengthen in time. He did not strengthen in time. Langdon Clemens died of diphtheria on the 2nd of June, 1872, at 19 months old. Sam carried a guilt about the boy's death for the rest of his life, believing that a carriage ride he had taken with Langdon in cold weather, when he had not been sufficiently careful about keeping the child warm, had contributed to the illness that took him. Whether that guilt was medically justified is something the record does not allow us to determine with certainty. What is not in question is that Sam carried it, quietly and without resolution, for decades. Langdon was buried in Elmira. He is rarely mentioned in the popular accounts of Mark Twain's family life, and the omission is a kind of small injustice, because he was the first person Sam and Olivia lost together, and the loss arrived before the Hartford years had properly begun. Susie was born in March of 1872, the same year Langdon died, life arriving in the same season as loss, as it sometimes does. Without explanation or apology, Clara was born in 1874. Jean was born in 1880. 3 daughters who grew up in a household that was, by every account of the people who spent time there, unusually alive with talk and story and invention. Sam read to the girls. He invented stories for them at bedtime, elaborate, continuing narratives that the children could direct by pointing at objects in the room that had to be incorporated into whatever came next. He played with them in the way of a father who had not forgotten what it felt like to be a child with too much energy and not enough world to put it into. Susie was the one he was closest to. She was intellectually precocious and emotionally sensitive, and the closeness had the specific quality of recognition, the sense that this particular child understood him in a way that was not quite like anyone else's understanding. She started, at the age of 13, writing a biography of her father, working from observation and from conversations with him, producing a document he treasured for the rest of his life and quoted in his autobiography with a tenderness that is different in register from almost everything else in that enormous text. She titled it, Papa, An Intimate Biography of Mark Twain, and it was eventually published long after both of them were gone. Olivia ran the household with the combination of warmth and competence that her upbringing had prepared her for. She was the organizing intelligence of a home that received a constant stream of visitors, managed a staff, raised 3 daughters, and simultaneously served as the first and most trusted reader of everything her husband produced. Her editorial involvement in his work was real and specific. She read his manuscripts and argued with him about them. She noticed things that were not working. She pushed back with the engaged response of a reader who knew the work from the inside and was not afraid to say when something was wrong. The neighbours also remarked on him. He was, by the mid-1870s, one of the most recognizable figures in Hartford, which was one of the wealthiest cities per capita in the United States at that time. A city of insurance companies and precision manufacturing and old New England money that expressed itself in understatement and reserve. Sam Clemens expressed himself in almost exactly the opposite way, and Hartford received him with a particular affection that prosperous, serious communities sometimes develop for the one genuinely funny person in their midst. He was not the only serious writer in the neighbourhood. The area known as Nook Farm was a genuine literary community. Harriet Beecher Stowe lived nearby, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. A story that has circulated widely holds that Abraham Lincoln, on meeting Stowe in 1862, said, "So you are the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." The exchange was first reported by Stowe's son, Charles Edward Stowe, in a biography of his mother published in 1890. And historians continue to debate whether Lincoln spoke those exact words. What is not disputed is the scale of her work's impact, or the genuine friendship that developed between the Stowe and Clemens households in the Nook Farm years. The Hartford years. From the early 1870s through 1891, when the family left for Europe, were the years of abundance in almost every sense that word can carry. Creative abundance, the sustained productive period during which the major works appeared. Financial abundance, relative to anything Sam had known before, and personal abundance, the particular richness of a family life that was, by every account of the people who spent time in the house on Farmington Avenue, genuinely warm in ways that the houses of merely successful people often are not. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer was published in 1876. It is the Hannibal of his memory, the river town of his childhood rendered in the warm light of retrospect. The boy who runs and schemes and is afraid, but not too afraid. It is not usually treated as the same kind of masterpiece as Huckleberry Finn, but it has remained in print and in readers' lives for 150 years because it captures something true about a particular kind of American childhood that has not entirely disappeared, even as the physical world that produced it has. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was published in 1884 in England and 1885 in the United States. It is a different kind of book entirely, and the difference is not simply one of quality. Though the quality is considerably higher, it is a difference in ambition and in honesty and in the willingness to follow the logic of the story wherever it leads, even when where it leads is somewhere that the American reading public was not comfortable going. It is worth being direct about what the book is actually doing. Huckleberry Finn is a book about freedom and about the particular form that the denial of freedom took in American life. In it, a white boy and an enslaved man travel together down the Mississippi River, and the moral education of the story consists of the white boy learning, slowly and against the resistance of everything his society has taught him, that the enslaved man is a full human being whose freedom matters as much as any other freedom. The moment in which Huck decides he will go to hell rather than betray Jim to the slave catchers is one of the most significant moral moments in American literature. And it lands as hard as it does because Twain has been completely honest about what Huck believes before he makes the decision. He believes that helping Jim is wrong. He has internalized the moral framework of his society, and he chooses to act against it anyway, not because he has been persuaded that the framework is wrong, but because his direct experience of Jim as a human being has made it impossible for him to apply the framework in this specific case. That is not a comfortable moral. It offers something harder and more honest than the satisfaction of a character who has reached the right conclusion by the right reasoning. Ernest Hemingway, in Green Hills of Africa, published in 1935, wrote that all modern American literature comes from Huckleberry Finn. That is not a casual observation. It is a precise identification of where the particular American literary tradition of first-person vernacular narration, of the outsider's view of official culture, of the moral education that comes from direct experience rather than received instruction, where all of that begins. It begins in the voice of a boy on a raft on the Mississippi. Huckleberry Finn has continued to be challenged, removed, assigned, and argued over in schools and libraries since its publication. The grounds for objection shifting across different generations, while the arguing itself never quite stops. That particular combination of responses is the most accurate measure of how important the book is. Work that unsettles, nothing gets assigned and forgotten. Work that keeps generating argument has touched something that has not been resolved. Life on the Mississippi was published in 1883, The Prince and the Pauper in 1882, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court in 1889. The range of these books, from the childhood idyll of Tom Sawyer to the satirical violence of the Connecticut Yankee, represents a creative output in a 15-year period that very few American writers of any era have matched in either quantity or quality. He was doing all of this while maintaining friendships with people as various as former President Ulysses S. Grant, whose memoirs he would eventually publish through his own company, and Nikola Tesla, who visited the Hartford house and found in Twain, according to accounts Tesla gave in later years, a combination of intelligence and warmth that he found rare among men of great accomplishment. Two of the most original minds of the Gilded Age, one working with the invisible forces of electricity, the other with the invisible forces of language, finding in each other something that felt like genuine relief. The money was real, and the expenses were substantial. The gap between what he earned and what the household required was manageable in the good years, and the prospects seemed strong enough that the gap did not receive the structural attention it should perhaps have received. The thing that would change everything was already entering his life. He had always been fascinated by technology. In 1880, he was introduced to James W. Page, an inventor who had developed a machine that he claimed could set type mechanically, automating the process that Sam had learned by hand as a boy in Hannibal. The machine was called the Page Compositor. He looked at it and he saw the future. He saw every hand compositor in the world replaced by this machine. He saw the entire economics of the printing industry transformed. He saw a fortune of a scale that would make everything else he had earned look modest. He was not wrong about the technology's potential. As subsequent developments in the industry would confirm, mechanical typesetting was indeed the future. The linotype machine, invented by Ottmar Mergenthaler and put into commercial operation in 1886, proved that. He was wrong about this particular machine, and the wrongness was going to cost him everything. The Hartford years had been the best years of his life. They had also been the years in which the catastrophe was quietly assembling itself. One beautiful, broken, 18,000-part machine at a time. Chapter 7. The Investor Who Lost Everything. The Page Compositor was a beautiful machine. That is the first thing to understand about it, because the beauty of it was part of what made it so dangerous. James W. Page was not a fraud in the simple sense of a man who had built a fake and was selling it knowingly. He was something more complicated and in some ways more treacherous. He was a genuine inventor who who had built a machine of extraordinary mechanical ingenuity that solved, with elegant precision, almost every problem involved in automating the typesetting process. And that failed, with equal consistency, to work reliably enough to be commercially useful. It had 18,000 separate parts. 18,000. The linotype machine that would eventually transform the industry had considerably fewer, because its designer had understood that complexity in a machine that must run continuously is not a virtue. Page did not understand this, or understood it and could not stop himself anyway, because the beauty of the solution was more compelling to him than the practicality of the result. Sam Clemens understood none of this when he first encountered the machine in 1880. What he understood was that it was magnificent, the way its mechanisms engaged and disengaged with a precision that seemed almost organic, the way it did in metal what his own fingers had done in those long-ago printing houses in New York and Philadelphia and Cincinnati. He was looking at a system of moving parts, so complex and so perfectly interdependent that the whole seemed to transcend the sum of its components. He invested. He invested a small amount at first, then more again. The pattern was consistent and, in retrospect, entirely predictable. The machine was always almost working. There was always one more problem to be solved, one more adjustment to be made, one more component to be redesigned, after which it would be ready and the patents could be licensed and the fortune would arrive. Page was masterful at presenting these incremental advances as evidence of approaching completion rather than as evidence of the fundamental instability of the whole enterprise. 2.4. On one occasion, Sam invited a wealthy potential investor to Page's workshop to see the machine demonstrated. He arrived to find it completely disassembled. Page had taken it apart overnight to install an improvement. The potential investor left without investing. Sam stayed. That single detail tells you everything about the dynamic between them. Sam poured money into the Page compositor across roughly 12 years. From the early 1880s through 1894, the total he invested has been documented at $300,000, a figure equivalent to somewhere between $8 and $10 million in present-day terms. $300,000 that represented the bulk of his book profits across the most productive, creative decade of his life. A substantial portion of Olivia's inheritance from her father, and the financial reserves that should have been building against an uncertain future. The Hartford house was mortgaged. The income from his books and lectures, which was substantial, was redirected toward the machine rather than toward the household. The New York Evening Telegram, in a line preserved in the historical record, described the Page compositor as marvelously ingenious and perfect from a mechanical standpoint, and worthless commercially. The costliest machine ever built. He was not blind to the risk. He was not stupid about money in the sense of not understanding arithmetic. What he was unable to do was apply to his own situation the satirical intelligence he applied so readily to everyone else's. He had written about the gullibility of investors, about the American weakness for the certain fortune that is always just around the next bend, with precisely the kind of clear-eyed understanding that should have protected him from exactly this. It did not protect him. Catty Leary, the Clemens family's long-time housekeeper, later recalled how completely Sam had believed in the machine, how he had talked about buying all the newspapers in New York on the strength of what it would earn, how his faith in it had been total in the way that only the faith of a person who has never been seriously wrong about the things they understand best can be total. He had been seriously wrong this time. There is a psychological observation embedded in this episode that Twain himself eventually made explicit. He said, in various formulations across the years, that the two most dangerous things that could happen to a human mind were giving it too much money and giving it a beautiful idea. The money made you feel invulnerable. The idea made you feel chosen. The combination made you feel that the ordinary rules of risk and consequence did not apply to your particular situation, because your particular situation was different in the specific and essential way that this idea was real. His situation was not different. By 1893, as the American economy moved into the severe depression that followed the financial panic of that year, the combination of the machine's failures and the general economic contraction made the publishing company he had founded, Charles L. Webster and Company, untenable. The company had published Huckleberry Finn and had published the memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant with genuine success. But the publishing business required capital that the Page investment had consumed, and the economic conditions of the early 1890s made borrowing impossible. Charles L. Webster and Company declared bankruptcy in April of 1894. Sam owed approximately $100,000 to creditors. He was 58 years old. He had spent 20 years building everything he had in Hartford. The house, the reputation, the financial stability that would have made the rest of his life and his family's life secure. And the machine had taken it. The response he made to this situation is one of the things about him that requires genuine respect. Entirely separate from the literary achievement and the celebrity, he did not file for the personal bankruptcy that would have been legally available to him and that would have discharged his obligations. His lawyer and his business advisors recommended this. It was the rational financial decision. He refused. He said, in terms that were simple and direct and did not leave much room for interpretation, that the debts were his and he intended to pay them, not because the law required it, because the people to whom he owed money had extended credit in good faith, and their good faith deserved to be honoured. He said, in a statement that was widely reprinted at the time, that honour is a harder master than the law. Henry Huttleston Rogers, a Standard Oil executive who became one of Sam's closest friends in this period, helped him organize his situation and develop a plan. Rogers was a complicated figure, enormously wealthy through an industry whose practices were not always admirable, and his friendship with Twain produced the kind of paradox that Twain's life produced regularly. The man who wrote most incisively about the corruptions of the Gilded Age depending for his financial survival on one of the Gilded Age's most successful operators. Twain acknowledged this paradox directly and without apparent discomfort. He liked Rogers. He trusted Rogers. Rogers was good to him in ways that went beyond professional obligation. Life was complicated. He had always known that. The plan was straightforward. Sam would lecture. He would go wherever audiences would pay to hear him and give them what they came for, and apply the income to the debt. He had been a professional lecturer for nearly 30 years. He was still one of the most compelling performers on the public stage. The instrument still worked. He would go around the world. But before the tour began, before the tickets were arranged and the route was mapped, there was a morning in the house on Farmington Avenue that the biographies do not linger on, but that is not difficult to imagine. The house that had taken years to build and had been the physical expression of everything the Hartford years were supposed to be, That house was going to be left behind. The study on the top floor where the work had been done. The porch shaped like a riverboat deck. The speaking tubes connecting the floors. The rooms where Susie and Clara and Jean had grown from children into young women. Sam and Olivia and Clara left for Europe in June of 1891, renting the house out to strangers. Susie and Jean remained behind in the care of the Langdon family in Elmira. Susie would eventually make her way back to Hartford, to the house on Farmington Avenue, waiting for the moment the family could be together again. Clara later wrote that she knew, even then, that they would not return to live there. He packed his bags. He made his plan. He had debts to pay and a world to cross and work to do. The river had taught him that when the water gets shallow, you do not stop. You slow down. You pay attention. You read the surface for what it is telling you about what lies beneath. He kept moving. Chapter 8. Around the World in Debt. He left Elmira in the summer of 1895, heading first to Cleveland, where the lecture tour officially began on the 14th of July, and the world that received Mark Twain on the other side of the podium was a world that already knew his name. This was not a minor thing. He was about to travel to places where English was a second language, or a colonial inheritance, or simply the language of newspapers that had been reprinting his work for 30 years without always asking permission. And in all of those places, the name had arrived before the man. Olivia travelled with him. Clara travelled with them. The three of them constituted a small and self-contained unit moving through a world of hotel rooms and lecture halls and train compartments, with Sam performing every night and Olivia managing everything that performance requires when the performer is 59 years old and carrying more weight than the audience can see. He was tired before he started. The bankruptcy proceedings had been draining in the way that legal and financial disasters are draining, not just in money, but in the specific energy that it takes to maintain dignity, when dignity is exactly what the situation seems designed to strip away. He had maintained it, but the maintenance had cost him. They crossed the Great Lakes and worked their way west through Minnesota and Montana and the Pacific Northwest, with Sam lecturing in city after city, the audiences filing in to see the old lion in the white hair, the man who had made them laugh for 30 years, and finding that he could still do it. The instrument was older. The timing was the same. They sailed from Vancouver on the 16th of August, 1895, across the Pacific toward Australia. Australia received him with the enthusiasm of a country that had been reading him for decades and had not expected to see him in person. The lectures sold out. The newspapers covered his arrival with the thoroughness of people who were not entirely sure what category of visitor he represented. Somewhere between a head of state and a natural phenomenon, he was good on the stage because he was always good on the stage when the need was absolute. And the need was now absolute in a way it had never quite been before. He wrote about Australia in Following the Equator, published in 1897, with the honest attention he brought to every place he went. He noted the treatment of the Aboriginal population with a directness that the official versions of Australian colonial history preferred to omit. He was one of the few people in his position, a beloved American entertainer welcomed with genuine warmth by the Australian establishment, who said it plainly in a book his hosts would eventually read. He went to New Zealand. He went to India in January of 1896 and stayed for 2 months, moving through a subcontinent of staggering complexity and beauty and injustice, recording all three with the attention of a writer who is genuinely trying to see a place rather than to confirm what he already thinks about it. He wrote letters to Rogers throughout the journey, financial and personal both. The financial letters document the careful arithmetic of a man watching every dollar earned and applying it with discipline to the ledger of what is owed. The tour was working. The income was real. The debt was being retired. Slowly and steadily, on stages on the other side of the world from where the debt had been made. The tour officially ended in Cape Town on the 15th of July, 1896. They sailed for England. He had travelled to 140 venues across 4 continents. The debt that Rogers had been managing back in New York was nearly retired. The arithmetic of the world tour had worked. He landed in England at Southampton and went to the house he had rented in Guildford, Surrey. Susie was supposed to be coming from America to join them there. She had made her way back to Hartford, to the house on Farmington Avenue, waiting. The telegram arrived within days of his landing. Susie was ill. The illness was spinal meningitis. The word serious in a telegram of that era, before antibiotics, before the treatments that now make spinal meningitis survivable in most cases, meant something different from what it means today. It meant something that a parent reading it in a rented house in England understood immediately and without ambiguity. Sam and Olivia prepared to sail back immediately. They were still on the Atlantic when the second telegram arrived. Susie Clemens died on the 18th of August, 1896, in the Hartford house on Farmington Avenue, the house where she had spent her childhood, the house where she had sat at a desk at the age of 13 and begun writing her biography of her father. She was 24 years old. She died in the house the family had left behind, while her parents were crossing the ocean trying to reach her, with her father's books on the shelves around her and her own unfinished words still in the room. Sam and Olivia did not go back to Hartford after that. They could not. They stayed in England through the fall and winter, then moved to Vienna, then to other European cities, the rootless motion of people who have had the fixed centre of their lives removed and cannot yet find anything stable enough to build around. He paid the last of the debt in January of 1898. Rogers announced it in a letter that was also an accounting, showing a balance of 0. Everything owed had been paid. Every creditor had received the full amount with interest. He had done what he said he would do. He was 62 years old. He was in Europe with his wife and his daughter. The Hartford years were over in a way that went beyond the practical fact of the mortgaged house. They were over because Susie was gone. Without Susie, the Hartford years were a country that had been real and was now, in the specific way of countries that depend on the living presence of a particular person, simply and permanently closed. He sat in a rented room somewhere in Europe that winter and put his pen to paper. He kept writing. He had always kept writing, but something had changed in the quality of the silence between the sentences. The darkness that had always been one of the currents running beneath the comedy was no longer running beneath it. It was rising. It was becoming the thing itself. Chapter 9. The Dark Years. There is a passage in a letter Sam Clemens wrote to his friend Joseph Twitchell in the months after Susie's death that has been quoted by biographers often enough to have become one of the reference points for understanding what the loss did to him. He wrote that the mind has a dumb sense of vast loss. That is all. It will take mind and memory months, and possibly years, to gather the details and thus learn and know the whole extent of the loss. He was right about the years. He spent the last 14 years of his life gathering the details, and the gathering took the form of writing, much of it sealed away from public view, some of it not released until after his death, and some of it not released for 100 years. The family moved through Europe in the pattern that had established itself after Susie's death. Vienna, from 1897 to 1899, where Sam was received as a celebrity of the first order and wrote prolifically in hotel rooms while Olivia rested. Then London, then Switzerland, where Olivia's health required the mountain air that the doctors of that era prescribed for conditions of the lungs and heart. She had not been well since before the world tour. The combination of the financial disaster and the travelling and the loss of Susie had asked more of her constitution than her constitution had in reserve. Jean, the youngest daughter, had been diagnosed with epilepsy in the early 1890s, at a time when the condition was imperfectly understood and the available treatments were crude and inconsistent. The family spent years seeking help from specialists across Europe without finding anything that reliably controlled the seizures. Jean's condition added a layer of continuous anxiety to the family life that sat underneath everything else, present in the background of every decision about where to go and how to live. Sam wrote through all of it. What he was writing in these years was darker than anything he had published before. The Mysterious Stranger exists in multiple, unfinished versions. The earliest begun around 1897, and the work continuing in various forms through the first decade of the 1900s. It is a story set in medieval Austria, in which a young boy and his friends encounter a being who identifies himself as Satan. Not the theological figure of traditional belief, but something closer to a representation of the universe's complete indifference to human suffering. The stranger performs miracles and atrocities with equal ease and equal detachment, and what he offers the boy as a final revelation is not comfort or meaning, but the suggestion that human life, with all its pain and its brief moments of joy, is a dream that never quite happened. No version of the Mysterious Stranger was complete when he died. The version published in 1916, 6 years after his death, was heavily edited by his literary executor Albert Bigelow Paine in ways that scholars have since established misrepresented what Twain actually wrote. The original manuscripts were not fully examined and published until the 1960s, when the Mark Twain Papers project at the University of California, Berkeley, began the systematic scholarly work on his unpublished writing that continues to this day. What is Man? A philosophical dialogue written in the late 1890s and published anonymously in a private edition in 1906, argues with systematic thoroughness that human beings are entirely determined by forces outside their control, that free will is an illusion, that the self we believe we have chosen is assembled for us by circumstances we did not choose. He published it anonymously and in a private edition, which tells you something about his understanding of what he was writing and for whom. He was not suicidal. He was not incapacitated. He kept performing on occasion, kept writing letters of genuine wit and warmth, kept engaging with ideas and people with an attention that the darkness did not diminish. The comedy had not disappeared. It had changed its relationship to what it was carrying. It had become less a way of avoiding the darkness, and more a way of standing inside it and remaining recognizably human while you did. He returned to the United States in October of 1899. The country he came back to had fought and won the Spanish-American War while he was in Europe, and had acquired the Philippines and Guam and Puerto Rico, and was in the process of suppressing a Filipino independence movement that had expected the defeat of Spain to produce freedom, and had discovered instead that it had produced a different colonialism. The anger that had been building in him across the dark years found, in this, a direction it could use. He became, in the first years of the 1900s, one of the most prominent voices of the anti-imperialist movement in American public life. His essay, To the Person Sitting in Darkness, published in the North American Review in February of 1901, addresses the gap between the stated ideals of the Western imperial powers and the actual conduct of their imperial enterprises, with a directness that his targets found difficult to answer. The facts he cited were difficult to dismiss, and the logic he drew from them was hard to answer. He was also involved in writing and speaking against King Leopold II of Belgium and his conduct in the Congo Free State, where the extraction of rubber was being accomplished through a system of forced labour and killing that modern historians classify as one of the major atrocities of the colonial era. Twain's King Leopold's Soliloquy, published in 1905 as a fundraising pamphlet for the Congo Reform Association, was among the earliest examples of what we would now call sustained celebrity advocacy on behalf of an international human rights cause. These were not the actions of a man broken by grief. They were the actions of a man who had processed enough grief to be angry in a direction that was useful. The loss had not diminished his capacity for outrage. It had stripped away what remained of the caution between his private convictions and his public voice. But the losses continued. Olivia's health had been declining since the late 1890s. She died on the 5th of June, 1904, in Florence, Italy, at the Villa di Quarto. After a long period of increasing weakness, she was 58 years old. They had been married for 34 years. He was in the room with her at the end. He sat with her for a long time after she was gone. He wrote about it in his notebook afterward, and the writing has a quality that nothing else in his work quite has. A quality of pure feeling, unmediated by the comic intelligence that had always, everywhere else, been present as a shaping force. He went back to the United States. He moved into a house in New York at 21 Fifth Avenue, and later into Stormfield in Reading, Connecticut, and the years that followed had their own texture, different from everything that had come before. Clara was building her own life as a concert singer, and on the 6th of October, 1909, she married the Russian pianist and conductor Osip Gabrilowitsch in the drawing room at Stormfield, with Sam standing beside her. He was glad for her. He said so. The gladness was real, and the ceremony was real, and the house was full for one day in the way that houses full of loss sometimes fill again briefly when someone in them begins something new. Jean was with Sam at Stormfield in the final months. Her epilepsy managed with varying success. She had been allowed to come home in April of 1909 after years in an epileptic colony in Katona, New York, and the reunion between them was warm and careful. Two people finding their way back to each other in the time that remained. She had taken over the management of the household with a competence and cheerfulness that moved him genuinely. Then, on the 24th of December, 1909, Jean died. She was found in the bathtub that morning by her maid, after apparently having suffered a seizure. Whether the cause was heart failure or asphyxiation, the accounts from that period do not settle cleanly. But the outcome was beyond question. She had been helping to decorate the house for Christmas just hours before. She was 29 years old. He sat down that night and wrote about it. He wrote a piece he called The Closing Words of his autobiography, a precise account of an ordinary Christmas Eve morning that became an unbearable one, written in the same plain and exact language he had always used for the things that mattered most. He wrote about Jean's hands, busy with the Christmas decorations. He wrote about the specific quality of a silence that replaces a person who was present just hours before. He was 74 years old. He had outlived his son and his wife and 2 of his 3 daughters. He had outlived most of his friends. He had outlived the Mississippi he had known, and the Hartford he had built, and the century that had formed him. Outside, somewhere in the winter sky, the comet was already on its way back. Chapter 10. The Old Lion and His Autobiography. Picture the billiard room at Stormfield on a winter afternoon in 1908. The light comes in low through the windows and falls across the green felt of the table in the specific way that afternoon light falls in a room that faces the wrong direction for the season. Useful enough to play by, but already carrying the early darkness of a Connecticut December. The balls click against each other with a sound that is precise and satisfying in the way that all sounds are satisfying when a physical discipline is being practiced by someone who has been practicing it for decades. The man at the table is in his early 70s, wearing white flannel as he always does now, in all seasons, because he decided some years ago that his image was available as a medium of expression, and that this was the expression he intended. This is how Mark Twain spent many of his afternoons at Stormfield, playing billiards, receiving visitors, smoking the cigars his doctors had told him for years were contributing to the cardiovascular situation he declined to discuss with anyone who intended to tell him what to do about it. There is a particular kind of authority that a person acquires not through achievement alone, but through the combination of achievement and survival. It is the authority of someone who has been in the room long enough to have watched everyone else leave, who carries in their bearing the accumulated weight of everything that has been lived through, and who has arrived at an age where the performance of modesty is no longer either necessary or convincing. By the time the first decade of the 1900s was well underway, Twain had this authority, and he wore it the way he wore the white suits, with the ease of a man who has finally arrived at an identity that fits without effort. The white suit had become, by this period, something beyond personal style. In the winter of 1906, he appeared before a congressional committee in Washington that was considering copyright legislation, dressed entirely in white in a season when white was not worn, and the effect was precisely what he intended. The reporters wrote about the suit as much as the testimony, which was exactly right, because the suit was part of the testimony. It said, without words, that this man existed on his own terms and always had, that the person standing before the committee in the wrong season's wrong colour was the same person who had been standing in the wrong place, saying the wrong things for 50 years, and had been right about most of them. The autobiography had been underway in various forms since the 1880s, when he had made several attempts to write a conventional memoir, and abandoned each of them as insufficient to the task. The problem, as he eventually identified it, was the form itself. A conventional memoir moved forward in time from beginning to end. But a life as it is actually experienced does not move that way. It moves associatively, the present moment triggering memories in no particular chronological order. following the logic of resonance rather than the logic of sequence. In 1906 he began dictating to his stenographer, Josephine Hobby, and the dictation sessions produced something genuinely new in the history of autobiography. He talked about whatever he wanted to talk about, in whatever order it came to him, moving between the present and the past without the organizing pressure of chronology. He talked about his childhood and his marriages and his failures and the people he had loved and the people he had found ridiculous and the political outrages of the current moment with equal ease. The way a man talks, when he is no longer concerned with how he will be received. He had instructed that the most candid sections not be released for 100 years. The instruction was not theatrical. It was practical. He was writing about living people, about people whose feelings could be hurt and whose reputations could be damaged. And he was writing about them honestly. The 100 years was the interval he calculated was sufficient to separate the honest record from the living damage it might do. The Autobiography of Mark Twain was first published in full, beginning in 2010, by the University of California Press, exactly 100 years after his death, as the instruction required. What the full autobiography reveals is a mind that remained until very close to the end, in full possession of its faculties. The late dictations have the same quality of observation and the same quality of language that characterizes the best of the earlier work. The age is there, the accumulated losses are there, but the voice is there too. Still precise, still funny in the dry and particular way that no one else managed in quite the same register. He received honorary degrees from Yale in 1901, from the University of Missouri in 1902, and from Oxford University in 1907. The Oxford degree required one more transatlantic crossing, and it produced one of the great late chapters of his public life. The English received him with a warmth that was different in quality from American celebrity, less proprietary, more purely celebratory. He came back from Oxford changed in a way that several people who knew him noticed. Not transformed, but something had settled. Something had been confirmed that perhaps needed confirming. He also gathered around him in these years a group of young girls between the ages of roughly 10 and 16, daughters of friends and acquaintances, whom he called his angel fish. He corresponded with them and invited them to visit Stormfield, and enjoyed their company with a warmth that he described in the autobiography and in his letters as filling something of the space left by the daughters he had lost. Modern readers may find the arrangement unusual, and it should be understood in its historical context rather than romanticized. The relationships were, by every examination, the historical record permits. Without impropriety, what the letters show most clearly is a man who had loved his daughters with a completeness that their deaths had made impossible to redirect, and who found in the company of these visitors something that approximated the warmth of those relationships. The angina that had been troubling him for several years was worsening by 1910. He knew it. He made the characteristic decision to live with this knowledge without allowing it to become the organizing principle of his daily existence. He travelled to Bermuda in January of 1910, partly for the warmth, partly for the quality of the light there, and partly, perhaps, to be somewhere beautiful in the time that remained. He came back to Stormfield in April of 1910. He liked to say, and perhaps partly believed, that the comet would come back for him. He had said so in letters and in conversation across the final years of his life, noting that he had come in with Halley's comet in 1835 and expected to go out with it. The comet was in the sky now. It had been visible since late March, a smear of light in the western sky after sunset. Moving on its long path back toward the perihelion, it would reach on the 20th of April. He was home. He was tired. He had one more chapter to finish. Chapter 11. The Comet Returns. Picture the bedroom on the second floor of Stormfield in the first days of April. The windows face west. The April light comes in low and long across the Connecticut hills. The way spring light does in New England when the season has arrived on the calendar, but has not yet committed to the warmth it keeps promising. The hills outside are beginning to show the first tentative green of the year. The colour of a season that is arriving but has not yet decided to stay. On the table beside the bed there are books. Because there are always books. There is a cigar because there is always a cigar. There is a notebook because there is always a notebook. And because the words have been going into notebooks for 5 decades, and the habit does not stop, simply because the hand that holds the pen has grown slower, he is in the bed more than he is out of it now. The heart is requiring the rest he had always been reluctant to give it. Clara is there. She came back when it became clear that this spring would be the last one. And she is managing the household and the visitors and the correspondence with the competence that has always been hers, from the most difficult position a person can occupy, the position of a daughter who knows what is coming and is trying to be present to it without being destroyed by it. The comet is in the sky. Halley's comet had been visible since late March, crossing the western sky after sunset, moving on its long elliptical path back toward the sun. It had crossed the same sky 74 years before, in November of 1835, passing over a small village in Missouri at the same time a baby was arriving in the world below. He had said, in various letters and conversations across the final years of his life, that he expected to go out with the comet. He had come in with it, and he intended to go out with it. He said this with the particular mixture of wit and genuine conviction that characterized everything he said, so that it was never entirely clear whether he was performing the expectation or holding it, or whether the distinction mattered. It is possible, in the end, that it did not matter. Some things are true and performed simultaneously. He had spent his entire life demonstrating that. The last weeks at Stormfield have been described by Clara in her memoir, My Father, Mark Twain, published in 1931, and by Albert Bigelow Paine in his authorized biography, published in 1912. The accounts agree on the essential quality of those weeks, not the quality of a man diminished by approaching death, but the quality of a man completing something, finishing in the way that a piece of writing finishes when the last necessary sentence has been found, and everything after it would be surplus. He talked with the people around him about the things that had always interested him, ideas and people, and the specific absurdities of human behaviour that had been his subject for 50 years. He was funny on occasion in those final weeks, not performing humour, but producing it in the involuntary way that people who are constitutionally comic produce it, because that is simply how their minds process the material the world provides, and the habit does not stop at the end any more than breathing stops before it stops. He told Clara that he was glad she was there. He said it directly, without the irony that had coated most of his emotional expressions across a lifetime of public performance, because the irony was a tool he had for the public version of himself, and what was happening at Stormfield in April of 1910 was not a public occasion. He was thinking about Olivia. He was thinking about Susie. He was thinking about Jean. He was thinking about the Hartford house, with its 25 rooms, and its speaking tubes, and its riverboat porch, and the sound of 3 girls running down the stairs on a Saturday morning. He was thinking about the river. The specific quality of the light on the Mississippi in the early morning, when the mist was still sitting on the water, and the boat was moving through it, and Horace Bixby was watching from the corner of his eye to see whether his cub could read what the mist was hiding. He had loved all of it. The river and the house and the daughters and the wife and the work and the country that had made him and that he had spent 50 years trying to tell the truth about. He had loved them with the specific and complete attention of a man who noticed everything and forgot nothing, and turned everything he saw and felt into words, because words were the only instrument he had that was large enough to hold what he was experiencing. On the 18th of April, he suffered a severe anginal attack at Stormfield that made clear the end was very close. Clara was with him. He died on the 21st of April. At Stormfield, in Reading, Connecticut, at approximately 6:30 in the evening, Halley's comet reached its perihelion, its closest approach to the sun, on the 20th of April, one day before he died. He had been right. He had come in with the comet in November of 1835, and he had gone out with it in April of 1910, and the 74 years between those 2 passages of the same light through the same sky had contained everything: the river and the printing house and the Nevada desert and the lecture stage and the Hartford house and Olivia and the 4 children and the white suit and the cigars and the 14 books and the 10,000 letters and the autobiography sealed in its box, and the question that all of it had been asking from the beginning. He was buried in Elmira, New York, in the Langdon family plot, beside Olivia, beside Susie, beside the son who had not survived his 2nd year, the family that the world had given him and then taken back, gathered together, finally, in the ground of the town where the best years had begun. Clara lived until 1962. She was the last person alive who had sat in the Hartford house when it was full, and the children were young, and the work was at its height, and the family was intact. She carried that particular knowledge for 52 years after his death, which is its own kind of remarkable. The Hartford house still stands on Farmington Avenue, a National Historic Landmark, open to visitors who want to walk through the rooms where the books were written, and the daughters grew up, and the family sat together in the evenings before the losses began. The 25 rooms on 3 floors, the study where he wrote late into the night, the porch shaped like a riverboat deck, the nursery where the original wallpaper tells the story of an animal wedding, the same wallpaper it had when there were children to fall asleep beneath it. His books are there too, all of them, in every form that 150 years of readers have found for them. The ones that made people laugh until they forgot to be uncomfortable, and then were uncomfortable anyway. The ones that did both things simultaneously, in the way that only the best writing manages. Huckleberry Finn has continued to be challenged, removed, assigned, and argued over in schools and libraries since its publication. The grounds for objection shifting across different generations, while the arguing itself never quite stops. That particular combination of responses is the most accurate measure of how important the book is. Work that unsettles nothing, gets assigned and forgotten. Work that keeps generating argument has touched something that has not been resolved. The autobiography he sealed for 100 years was opened and published in 2010, exactly as he had instructed, and the readers who came to it found a voice that was still, after all that time, unmistakably itself, still precise, still funny in the specific way that no one else managed in quite the same register, still honest about the things that most people, given the choice, prefer not to be honest about. He was one of the most American writers America has produced, not because he celebrated what America was, but because he saw it clearly, the whole of it, the beauty and the cruelty and the comedy and the injustice and the specific genius for self-deception that a country founded on ideals it has never fully honoured requires in order to keep believing in itself. He held up the mirror. He made it funny enough that people looked, and what they saw when they looked was themselves, more honestly rendered than was entirely comfortable. That is what the best writing does. That is what he did. He came in with the Comet and went out with the Comet, and in the 74 years between those two appearances of the same light in the same sky, he wrote the truth about America with enough humour and enough honesty and enough love for the people he was writing about that the truth landed, instead of being turned away at the door. The Comet is out there now, somewhere in the long cold arc of its orbit, moving away from the sun. It passed in 1986 and will not return to until approximately 2061. When it comes back, the people alive to see it will be the grandchildren of people who are children now, and they will have access, if they want it, to the words of a man who was born under the same light and who spent 74 years trying to tell the truth about what it meant to be alive in America. The words are still there. The light that made him and took him is still moving through the dark. And somewhere in Missouri, the river he learned when he was 23 years old is still running south toward the Gulf, still reading its own surface, still changing its own channel with the patient indifference to human plans that it has always had. He is in the current. He always has been. The river is still there if you know where to listen for it. It always is.